Welcome to U.S. History since 1877. In this course, you will survey the major themes, events, and ideas of American history after Reconstruction.
I'm Jordan O'Connell, History and Government Instructor at Northeast Iowa Community College. This lecture distills a decade of my written notes taken from Alan Brinkley's The Unfinished Nation, The American Yawp, and our course-assigned OpenStax U.S. History textbook. This lecture focuses on World War I, neutrality, and the mobilized democratic state. The core question is this: how neutral was the United States once its banks, exporters, shipping lanes, and war planners were tied to the conflict? The core competency is to characterize the social, political, and economic dimensions of military operations such as the Spanish-American War, the Philippine-American War, and the Great War. How long can neutrality survive once a nation's banks, exporters, shipping lanes, and war planners are already tied to the conflict it claims to be watching from a distance? When war began in Europe in August 1914, the United States declared neutrality, but American finance, trade, and strategic thinking were already bound to the Atlantic world. The open-door tradition had trained policymakers to think about access and international standing, and the imperial turn of 1898 had already widened the nation's strategic horizon. World War therefore forced Americans to decide how a modern industrial democracy would behave when trade, credit rights at sea, and global ambition all pushed against formal detachment. The crisis also changed the scale of government action. Entry in 1917 required the federal state to draft soldiers, supervise rail and shipping schedules, coordinate factory output, borrow on a vast scale, mobilize public opinion, and police dissent. The United States did not become a global actor only by sending troops to France. It became one by building agencies and emergency laws able to direct materials, labor, and information across the whole country. Wilson's language about making the world safe for democracy framed the war in moral terms, but shipping losses, Allied credit, submarine warfare, and the European balance of power remained central facts. The problem was never simply whether ideals were sincere. It was whether a republic could enter a global war without also enlarging the machinery it used to govern its own citizens. At the start of the war, Wilson urged Americans to be neutral in thought as well as in action. That aspiration proved difficult because the nation was economically entangled from the beginning. Britain commanded major sea routes and cable networks, shaping both trade and information. American exports to the Allies expanded sharply, and financial houses such as J.P. Morgan and Company helped arrange large Allied purchases and loans. Munitions, grain, machinery, and credit tied the United States materially to one side, even while the government remained formally non-belligerent. German submarine warfare challenged that position. Berlin used U-boats to strike at shipping around the British Isles, arguing that Britain's blockade had already blurred the line between civilian trade and military support. The sinking of the Lusitania in May 1915 killed nearly 1,200 people, including 128 Americans, and intensified public anger, even though the ship also carried rifle cartridges and other war materiel. The Sussex incident in 1916 renewed the crisis and led to the Sussex Pledge, under which Germany temporarily moderated submarine attacks on passenger vessels. Each episode revealed how hard it was for a trading nation to stay detached while insisting on neutral rights at sea. Congress and the executive branch also moved through a series of preparedness steps before war came. Wilson won re-election in 1916 under the slogan, "He kept us out of war." Yet the National Defense Act of June 1916 expanded the regular Army and National Guard, while the Naval Appropriations Act of August 1916 funded a larger battle fleet. Those measures did not declare intervention inevitable, but they showed that neutrality was already being backed by mobilization planning. Ports, shipyards, and ordnance makers were preparing for contingencies, even while diplomats exchanged notes about maritime rights. There were still alternatives before 1917. The United States could have cut trade more sharply, refused major financial entanglement, or accepted a narrower interpretation of neutral rights. Those paths became less likely because they threatened profits, prestige, and the larger American claim that citizens and goods should move through the world without coercive interference. The Zimmermann telegram, intercepted and publicized in early 1917, deepened the crisis by suggesting a German effort to encourage Mexico against the United States if war came. Then Germany resumed unrestricted submarine warfare in February 1917, betting that attacks on shipping would defeat the Allies before American mobilization could arrive in force. By that point, neutrality had become less a stable principle than a daily management problem involving law, ports, finance, and shipping. The government watched cargoes, protests, public opinion, and diplomatic notes, while industrial production increasingly served wartime demand abroad.
The route from neutrality to intervention was therefore gradual and administrative before it became military. It ran through ledgers, manifests, and maritime rights as much as through speeches. Shipping losses and war finance made delay look increasingly costly to policymakers. By 1917, American banks had extended billions in credits to the Allied powers, and exporters had reorganized production around wartime contracts for munitions, grain, copper, steel, and chemicals. If Britain and France failed, those debts and markets were at risk. Neutrality therefore collided with the balance sheets of bankers, manufacturers, farmers, and shippers whose fortunes were already tied to an Allied outcome long before Pershing's army sailed. The Sea War added a daily count to that pressure. Sinkings affected insurance rates, cargo schedules, port traffic, and the willingness of shippers to risk Atlantic crossings. So diplomatic principle and commercial calculation kept narrowing toward the same decision. By spring 1917, neutrality rested on paper more than on practice across the Atlantic economy. Wilson's April 1917 war message to Congress framed intervention as a defense of democracy, neutral rights, and a just international order. Congress declared war on Germany shortly afterward, but the decision created a new set of pressures. The United States had to raise an army rapidly because the regular army was too small for a continental war. The Selective Service Act of 1917 created a national draft system administered through local boards that classified, examined, and inducted millions of men. Military power now depended on bureaucracy that reached directly into towns, counties, and neighborhoods. Mobilization extended well beyond manpower. The War Industries Board, especially under Bernard Baruch, helped coordinate raw materials, production priorities, prices, and contracts. The Railroad Administration took federal control of the rail system in late 1917 to improve movement of troops and freight. The Food Administration under Herbert Hoover encouraged conservation and organized grain supply. Liberty Loan drives tied households to war finance by pressuring citizens to buy bonds. The Committee on Public Information under George Creel distributed pamphlets, posters, films, speeches, and press materials to create a broad culture of patriotic mobilization. The scale of that apparatus was enormous. Roughly 24 million men registered for the draft, and local boards sorted exemptions for dependents, occupations, and health conditions before more than 2.8 million were inducted. The War Industries Board standardized contracts and pushed factories toward priority orders for steel, copper, nitrates, trucks, and artillery. Under national control, railroads coordinated congested terminals, troop trains, and coal shipments with a unity private companies had failed to achieve. The state asked for sacrifice and backed that demand with filing systems, transportation schedules, and production commands that could redirect the economy in real time. The same mobilization narrowed tolerated dissent. The Espionage Act of 1917 criminalized interference with military operations and recruitment. The Sedition Act of 1918 extended punishment to disloyal, abusive, or scurrilous language directed at the government, constitution, flag, or military effort. Socialists, anti-war speakers, German language communities, labor critics, and pacifists all felt the pressure of this legal climate. Eugene V. Debs, already famous from earlier labor struggles, was convicted in 1918 after an anti-war speech in Canton, Ohio. His prosecution showed how quickly a democracy claiming global principle could punish domestic opposition in the name of wartime necessity. The information campaign worked on a similar scale. Creel's Committee on Public Information circulated millions of pamphlets, coordinated newspaper material, and sent 4-minute men into theaters to deliver short patriotic speeches during real changes. The Food Administration promoted meatless and wheatless days, while Liberty Loan drives used parades, celebrity appearances, and neighborhood pressure to convert households into wartime subscribers. Mobilization, therefore, depended on persuasion, surveillance, and social coercion together, not on military law alone. Congress and the Senate faced their own pressures. Wartime unity demanded appropriations, coordination, and deference to emergency authority. After the armistice, the debate shifted to the Treaty of Versailles and the League of Nations. Wilson wanted an ongoing international role anchored in collective security. Senate critics, including Henry Cabot Lodge, feared entanglement and loss of congressional control over war decisions. The same conflict that expanded American power abroad, therefore, also reopened an old argument over how permanently the Republic should bind itself to global commitments. When Wilson delivered the 14 points to Congress on January 8, 1918, he was trying to seize the terms of the peace before Allied bargains and battlefield exhaustion fixed them without him. The speech was crafted for several audiences at once: domestic progressives, Allied governments, Central Power civilians, colonial nationalists, and Russian observers who had heard Bolsheviks denounce secret diplomacy. Phrases such as open covenants, openly arrived at, freedom of the seas, and a general association of nations were not ornaments. They were bids for moral command in a war already saturated with suspicion. Each line was chosen to make American power sound principled, orderly, and distinct from old imperial bargaining. Calls for lower trade barriers and freer seas promised a world more open to commerce. References to colonial claims with equal weight for the populations concerned suggested fairness without naming a universal anti-colonial rule. The speech let Wilson speak the language of consent while preserving room for the victorious powers to decide where consent would actually count. That pressure became sharper because listeners abroad took the word seriously. Reformers, colonized intellectuals, and nationalist movements heard self-government in the language even where Wilson had drawn it narrowly. The room in Washington was controlled. The audience beyond it was not. Once those phrases circulated, they became tools others could use against the settlement the United States and its allies were preparing to impose. The speech also needs to be read beside the machinery operating at home. A government invoking democratic principle abroad was using the Committee on Public Information, postal controls, the Espionage Act, and the Sedition Act to punish dissent and enforce patriotic discipline. The 14 points therefore functioned as a wartime weapon in two directions at once: outward, as a claim to moral leadership in the peace settlement, and inward, as a way to dignify a state that was coordinating markets, speech, and loyalty under emergency conditions. The consequence of World War I was a United States more powerful abroad and more practiced in national coordination at home. American troops under John J. Pershing helped tip the balance on the Western Front in 1918, while American credit, shipbuilding, and factory output strengthened the Allied war effort long before the armistice. At home, federal agencies learned how to allocate freight, coordinate transport, shape opinion, and prosecute disloyalty through emergency statutes and centralized administration. The peace settlement exposed the limits of Wilson's internationalism without reversing the transformation. The Senate refused to ratify the Treaty of Versailles, and the United States never joined the League of Nations. Yet the country had already financed war abroad, transported mass armies, and claimed a decisive role in world order. Even partial retreat from the treaty did not restore pre-1914 habits. Global reach, war finance, and administrative capability remained in place. The domestic side was just as lasting. Liberty loans, tax changes, draft boards, rail schedules, propaganda offices, and intelligence files made citizens participants in national mobilization, while the Espionage and Sedition Acts showed how quickly speech and civil liberties could narrow under wartime pressure. Economists, shipping planners, railroad managers, lawyers, and engineers moved into federal service and treated emergency coordination as normal state practice. Later crises inherited both the administrative methods and the surveillance habits built during the war years. That is why the war leaves an unresolved choice, rather than a clean triumph. If global leadership depends on draft systems, censorship, transport control, and permanent coordination between executive power and expert administration, then the question is not whether the United States emerged stronger. The question is how much coercive machinery a democracy can build in the name of universal purpose before the methods of war begin redefining the republic at home.
If you're curious how I'm using AI to build these lectures and reshape higher education, visit thelibertytolearn.com. I'll see you in class.